December 1944. In a prisoner of war camp nestled in the mountains of Colorado, something unprecedented was about to happen. An event so emotionally charged, so unexpected, that it would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. 52 German women, captured during the final months of the war in Europe, were about to perform a concert for their American captors, not under duress, not as punishment or propaganda, but as an act of reconciliation, a gesture of shared humanity in the midst of warfare. And one song, a hauntingly beautiful piece about longing and loss, would move hardened American soldiers to tears and challenge everything they thought they knew about their enemies. Before we reveal what happened that December night, tell us where you are watching from in the comments below. The camp itself was a converted ranch on the outskirts of Denver. It had been hastily prepared to receive German prisoners, and the American military had decided that housing women prisoners separately from male prisoners made sense from a security standpoint. The facility was not cruel or inhumane. The women had adequate shelter, regular meals, and were treated according to the Geneva Convention. But it was still a prison. It was still a place of confinement and uncertainty about what the future would hold. The women arrived in stages throughout the fall of 1944, transferred from various locations across Europe as the American military consolidated its prisoner populations. They were nurses, radio operators, administrative clerks, and mechanics. They ranged in age from 18 to 47. They came from every region of Germany, speaking with different accents and dialects, carrying different stories of how they had come to be captured. Among them was Margaret Koch, a 26-year-old former music teacher from Stuttgart. Before the war, she had sung in church choirs and performed in small concerts in her hometown. She had studied music theory and composition. When the war began, she had tried to remain apolitical, focusing on her teaching and her passion for music. But as the Nazi regime had become increasingly totalitarian, she had been forced to choose between her values and her survival. She had chosen survival, joining the Luftwaffe Auxiliary, telling herself she was just a support worker, not really part of the military machine that had unleashed such horror on Europe. When she was captured, she had brought very little with her except her voice and her knowledge of music. In the prisoner of war camp in Colorado, she had discovered that music was one of the few things that could provide comfort and connection in an environment of enforced separation and uncertainty. She had begun singing quietly in her barracks in the evenings, first alone, then with a few other women who had musical inclinations. Word had spread among the prisoners and more women had joined. They began learning songs together, harmonizing, creating something beautiful in the midst of their imprisonment. The American commander of the camp, Captain Edward Walsh, had been unaware of this informal choir until one evening in mid-November, when he heard singing drifting across the compound. He had been startled at first, then moved. He had stood outside the barracks and listened to the women singing together, their voices blending in complex harmonies, creating something that was undeniably beautiful. The following day, he had called Margaret to his office. She had been terrified, convinced she was in trouble, that singing without permission was a violation of camp rules. But Captain Walsh had a different idea. He told her that the American soldiers at the camp were homesick and demoralized. Many of them were young men far from home for the first time. The war in Europe was nearly over, but there was still uncertainty about what came next, about whether they would be discharged or shipped to fight in the Pacific. They were bored and anxious and tired of the monotony of camp life. What if the German prisoners organized a concert? He asked. What if the women sang for the American soldiers? It would be an event, something to break up the routine, something to give both the prisoners and the guards something to do. Margaret had been shocked. She had not expected such a request. She had assumed that fraternization between prisoners and guards was not permitted. But Captain Walsh explained that music was different. Music was universal. Music transcended the boundaries of war. And he believed that an evening of music might do more to ease tensions and foster understanding than any amount of military discipline could accomplish. Margaret had agreed cautiously. She had approached the other women prisoners and explained the idea. The response had been mixed. Some women were excited about the opportunity to perform, to create something beautiful, to feel like they had agency and purpose again. Others were skeptical or nervous. Singing for their captors felt wrong to some, like a betrayal of their country, like collaboration. But eventually, after Margaret had spoken passionately about what music could achieve, about how singing together could remind them of their humanity, in a place where humanity was often eclipsed by the rules and structure of military life, the women had agreed to participate. They had spent 3 weeks preparing. They selected songs carefully. Some were traditional German folk songs, pieces that every German knew from childhood. Some were art songs, compositions by German masters that showcased the emotional depth and musical sophistication of German culture. And some were pieces that, while German, had taken on new meaning during the war. Songs about loss, about longing, about the hope for peace and an end to suffering. For the main selection, Margaret had chosen a particular piece, a song that was well known in Germany, a song that most German soldiers and civilians knew and loved. It was a composition that spoke to universal human emotions, to the experience of being far from home, to the pain of separation, and the uncertainty of whether loved ones had survived the war. She chose it not just for its beauty, but for its honesty. She wanted the American soldiers to understand something about the German people. She wanted them to see that Germans were not just the enemy, but people with cultures and traditions and emotions, people who had also suffered, people who also grieved and loved and longed for peace. The concert was scheduled for December 15th, 1944. American Command had decided to make it a special event. They arranged for the performance to take place in the camp's largest building, a converted barn that had been set up with rough wooden benches for seating. They organized transportation for American soldiers from nearby military installations to attend. They made arrangements for additional security, though Captain Walsh insisted that security should be subtle and non-threatening. The evening arrived cold and clear. The stars were visible overhead in the thin mountain air. The American soldiers began to file into the barn, curious about what they were about to witness. Some were skeptical. Why would they want to listen to Germans sing? Others were simply grateful for anything that broke up the monotony of camp life. The women prisoners were equally nervous. They had practiced extensively, but performance anxiety was real. They were about to sing in front of hundreds of American soldiers. If their performance was poor, if they were jeered or mocked, it would be humiliating. And worse, it might create conflict, might reinforce the idea among some of the Americans that fraternization with prisoners was a bad idea. Margaret stood backstage in a small room off the main barn, looking at the faces of the women who were about to perform with her. They were terrified. She could see it in their eyes, in the way they held their bodies, in how their hands trembled slightly. She took a deep breath and addressed them. "What we are about to do," she told them in German, "is something that goes beyond war. We are about to remind people that we are human beings, that German culture is not defined by the government that has ruled it, that we have something beautiful to offer the world, something that cannot be destroyed by violence or hatred. When we sing, we do not sing as enemies. We sing as artists, as human beings, as people who believe that beauty and art and music matter, even now, especially now." The women nodded, drawing strength from her words. They took their positions on the small stage that had been constructed in the barn. The curtain was drawn back, revealing them to an audience of several hundred American soldiers and officers. There was a moment of complete silence. The soldiers did not know what to expect. They had come to see German prisoners, to perhaps mock them, or simply to be entertained by the novelty of the situation. Instead, they were seeing 52 women in clean gray uniforms, standing in careful formation, their posture upright and dignified. Margaret stepped forward and addressed the audience in careful, accented English. She welcomed them. She thanked them for the opportunity to perform. She explained that the women had prepared songs that represented different aspects of German culture and tradition. Then she raised her hand and the women began their first song. It was a traditional folk melody, one that was joyful and energetic. The voices blended beautifully, the harmonies complex, but satisfying. The sound filled the barn, bouncing off the walls, creating a richness and depth that seemed impossible to produce with just human voices. The American soldiers sat transfixed. Many of them had never heard anything like it. The complexity of the harmonies, the precision of the execution, the emotion conveyed through the music was extraordinary. One by one, they were pulled in, drawn into the world that the singers were creating through sound. The first song ended, and there was a moment of stunned silence. Then applause broke out, genuine and warm. The women exchanged glances of cautious relief. The performance was going well. The Americans were responding positively. They were not heckling or mocking. They were listening with respect and appreciation. 3 more songs followed. Each one showcased a different aspect of German musical tradition. Each one was performed with technical precision and emotional authenticity. The American soldiers found themselves moved by the beauty of the music, by the demonstration of human artistry and cultural sophistication that they were witnessing. And then Margaret announced the final selection. She explained, in her careful English, that the last song was one that was very meaningful to German people, that it spoke to universal human experiences of loss and longing, that she hoped the Americans would understand what the song was about, even if they did not speak German. The accompanist, a young prisoner named Greta who had played in orchestras before the war, sat at an old upright piano that had been brought into the barn. She began to play a gentle, melancholic melody. The chords were simple but deeply moving, the progression of notes creating a sense of yearning and sadness. And then the women began to sing. The piece was a composition that had become particularly meaningful during the war. It was a song about loss and absence, about loved ones far away or dead, about the pain of separation and the uncertainty of whether people would survive to be reunited. It was a song that had been sung in German homes and military barracks, a song that carried the weight of the entire war experience. The melody was hauntingly beautiful. The harmonies were intricate, with women's voices creating layers of sound that were both sad and strangely comforting. The lyrics, sung in German, told a story of longing and hope, of remembering better times, of believing that somehow, despite everything, peace would come. As the song progressed, something happened that no one had anticipated. American soldiers began to cry, not from sentimentality or from being manipulated by music, but from genuine emotional recognition. Many of these young men had not received letters from home in weeks. Many did not know if their families and friends were alive or dead, as the war had disrupted mail services and filled the world with uncertainty. The song spoke to the universal human experience of missing home, of fearing loss, of hoping for reunion. Sitting in the audience was Private James Walker, a 19-year-old from rural Tennessee, who had not heard from his mother in almost 4 months. As he listened to the German women sing about loss and longing, he found tears streaming down his face. He was not crying for the Germans. He was crying for himself, for the homesickness he had been suppressing, for the fear that something had happened to his mother or his siblings that he did not know about. Beside him sat Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, a 34-year-old whose own father had died before the war. The song reminded him of his father, of the loss that still ached, even after all these years, of how war had taken so much from so many people, how it had created this strange gathering of enemies brought together by their shared experience of grief. At the back of the barn stood Captain Walsh, the man who had conceived of this event. Even he was moved to tears, though he had not anticipated this response. He had thought the concert would be a pleasant diversion, a way to boost morale and foster understanding between prisoners and guards. But what was happening was something deeper. The music had transcended the boundaries of nationality and conflict. It had created a moment where American soldiers were able to recognize themselves in a song sung by German women. They were able to see past the uniforms and the war and the artificial divisions that had been created by governments and militaries. They were able to see human beings like themselves, expressing universal emotions in a universal language that needed no translation. The song continued, building toward its conclusion. The harmonies grew richer and more complex. The women's voices poured out emotion and pain and hope all at once. When the final note died away, it was met with absolute silence. The silence filled the barn like a physical presence. No one moved. No one spoke. Everyone was suspended in the moment, in the emotional weight of what they had just experienced together. An American soldier and a German prisoner, connected through music, recognizing their shared humanity despite the war that had tried to convince them they were irreconcilable enemies. The silence lasted for perhaps 30 seconds. Then, slowly, someone began to clap, then another. Then the entire audience was on their feet, applauding thunderously. Some soldiers were still crying openly. Some were just clapping, unable to speak or do anything else to express what they were feeling. Margaret and the women looked at each other in shock. They had not expected this response. They had prepared a good concert, they had believed, but they had not anticipated that the music would touch something so deep, so primal in their audience. Captain Walsh was the first to approach the stage after the performance ended. He walked up to Margaret and shook her hand, his own hands trembling slightly. "That," he said simply, "was one of the most beautiful things I have ever witnessed." The concert continued through the night. After the formal performance ended, American soldiers approached the German prisoners, asking them to sing more, asking them to explain the songs, asking them to talk about music and culture and Germany. For several hours, the barrier between prisoner and guard dissolved. They were just people, talking about art and music and the things that mattered to the human spirit. Private Walker approached Margaret after the concert and asked her if she could explain the final song to him. Margaret explained that it was about the experience of loss and longing, about missing people and places, about the pain of separation, but also the hope that someday all the broken things could be healed. "Do you miss home?" Walker asked her. "Do you worry that your family might not have survived the war?" Margaret nodded slowly. "I have heard nothing from my family for over a year," she said quietly. "I do not know if my parents are alive. I do not know if my younger brother survived. I do not know if my hometown still stands. That song, it gives voice to all of that fear and pain and longing." Walker felt his throat tighten. "I have not heard from my mother in 4 months," he admitted. "I do not know if she is well. I do not know if she received my letters. I have been trying not to think about it, trying to focus on my duty as a soldier. But listening to that song tonight, I realized that I cannot stop being human just because I am in the military. I cannot stop missing home just because I am supposed to be strong." They stood together in silence for a moment, an American soldier and a German prisoner, united by their shared experience of worry and homesickness, and the universal human need for connection and reassurance that those we love are safe. News of the concert spread quickly through the military installation and beyond. Other camps requested that Margaret and the women prisoners be allowed to perform for American soldiers at their locations. More concerts were organized. Each time, the effect was similar. American soldiers, many of them homesick and demoralized, were moved by the music, and by the reminder that their enemies were also human beings with the same fears and longings and hopes that they had. The military eventually issued orders limiting the number of concerts that could be performed, concerned that too much fraternization between prisoners and guards could be a security risk or could undermine military discipline. But the impact of the singing had already been profound and lasting. After the war ended in May 1945, the women prisoners were eventually repatriated to Germany. Margaret Koch returned to Stuttgart, to a city that had been heavily damaged by bombing, but was slowly beginning to rebuild. She found her parents alive, though her younger brother had been killed in the final weeks of the war. The reunion was bittersweet, joy and grief intermingled. She eventually resumed her career as a music teacher, helping to restore music education in post-war Germany. She wrote about her experience as a prisoner of war, including detailed accounts of the concert in Colorado. Her memoir became well known in Germany and contributed to the slowly growing understanding between Germans and Americans in the post-war years. Private Walker kept the concert program, signed by all 52 women performers. He carried it with him for the rest of his life. When the war ended and he returned home to Tennessee, he found his mother healthy and well, though she had never received most of his letters. The joy of their reunion was tempered by the knowledge that his best friend had been killed in the Pacific Theater just days before the war ended. He would spend much of his adult life dealing with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress. But the memory of the concert, of sitting in a barn in Colorado listening to German women sing about loss and longing, remained one of the most meaningful experiences of his military service. He told his children about the concert. He told his grandchildren about it. He told anyone who would listen about the night when music had transcended war and had reminded him that the people on the other side of a conflict were not monsters, but complex human beings with the same hopes and fears that he had. Captain Walsh wrote a detailed report about the concert for his commanding officers. He documented the effect it had on the American soldiers. He advocated for more cultural exchange programs between prisoners and guards, arguing that understanding and respect could be built through art and music. His report was read by military strategists and policymakers who were beginning to think about how to handle the post-war world, about how to ensure that the next generation of Americans and Germans could build peace instead of continuing a cycle of hatred and conflict. Years later, when military historians studied this period, the concert in Colorado became a notable example of how unexpected moments of cultural exchange could impact people's understanding of their former enemies. It became cited as evidence that reconciliation between nations was possible, that art and music could serve as powerful tools for building bridges across divides. In 2000, at a reunion of World War II veterans, an elderly Private James Walker reconnected with an elderly Margaret Koch, who had emigrated to the United States in 1956 and lived most of her adult life in California. Walker had traveled to California specifically to find her, after reading an article about her life and career. When they saw each other at the reunion, both in their 70s now, they embraced like old friends. They spent hours talking about that night in December 1944, about the concert, about how it had affected them, about what it had meant for their understanding of war and humanity, and the possibilities for peace. Margaret told Walker that she had continued to sing for the rest of her life, that she had performed in concert halls across America and Europe, that she had dedicated her life to the idea that music could heal wounds created by war and hatred. She said that it all began with that concert in Colorado, with the moment when silence filled the barn, and hundreds of people recognized themselves in a song sung by their former enemies. Walker told Margaret that he had lived his entire adult life inspired by what she had done, by the courage it took to sing for people who could have dismissed her or mocked her or hurt her by her belief that beauty and art mattered even in the midst of terrible conflict. They exchanged contact information and corresponded for the remainder of their lives. When Margaret died in 2005, Walker attended her memorial service. He sat in the front row and listened to people speak about her contributions to music education, about her bridge-building work between Germany and America, about her belief that art was a language that transcended all national boundaries. The concert program that Walker had kept for over 60 years was eventually donated to a museum in Colorado. It is now displayed in an exhibit about World War II and reconciliation, with a detailed narrative explaining what happened that night in December 1944. Visitors to the museum read about the moment when silence filled the barn, when American soldiers cried while listening to German women sing, when music proved to be more powerful than any weapon, more effective at building peace than any military strategy. The impact of that concert extended far beyond the people who were present that night. It became a story that was told and retold, a story about what was possible when people refused to let war completely dehumanize their enemies, when they insisted on recognizing the shared humanity that transcended national boundaries and military conflict. That is the legacy of the German female prisoners who sang that December night in Colorado. They sang not as Germans or as prisoners or as enemies. They sang as artists and human beings, and in doing so they reminded an audience of American soldiers that even in war, even in the midst of hatred and violence and terrible conflict, It is still possible to recognize each other as people. It is still possible to cry together, to grieve together, to hope together. The silence that filled the barn that night was not empty. It was full of recognition and understanding, and the profound realization that war had not been able to completely erase the human capacity for connection and empathy and love. That is what the silence meant, and that is what the music meant. That even when governments and militaries and propaganda tell us that our enemies are monsters, there is still something in the human spirit that recognizes the other person as being like ourselves, something that responds to beauty regardless of which language it is expressed in, something that connects us across all the barriers that we have built. That concert in Colorado became proof that reconciliation was possible, that the cycle of hatred could be broken, that it was never too late to choose humanity over enmity. All it took was silence filled with beautiful music and the courage of German women willing to sing for people they had been taught to hate, and American soldiers willing to listen and to cry and to recognize their former enemies as fellow human beings.